Ignition sequence start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Schriever Spacepower series. I'm Kevin Chilton, Explorer Chair at the Mitchell Institute's Spacepower Advantage Center of Excellence. The United States today confronts numerous threats to our space capabilities and infrastructure. China has demonstrated its ability to strike ground stations, command and control networks, and even satellites in orbit. China and Russia increasingly show their willingness to challenge us in space. These competitors are fielding systems that can eradicate the space capabilities on which our air, land, maritime, and space forces depend. Given that context, we're pleased to welcome Lieutenant General David, also known as Rock Miller, Commander of Space Operations Command, better known as SpOC. As the commander at SpOC, General Miller is focused on providing combat-ready space power for America and our allies. So with that, General Miller, it's great to be with you. Always a pleasure to see you, and thanks for joining us today on our Space Power series.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate the time.
Great. And to begin, I'd like to give you the opportunity to offer some opening remarks to our audience.
That's great. Well, first off, let me say thanks to the entire Mitchell Institute. It's a good opportunity for us. I'm about 6 months in the seat tomorrow. So
congratulations.
It was the right time to come to you and have a chat about where Space Operations Command is, where we've been going over the last 180 days or so, and frankly, where we're headed in the future. Mm-hmm. So thanks for that. I think the good way to start is to recognize the context of the threat. As you pointed out, we've got potential adversaries outlined in our national defense strategy who continue at an impressive pace, both in speed, but also in breadth of capability to develop sensors, communications capability, as well as navigation and timing capability to find and track U.S. and allied forces. Simultaneously, what you've seen over the last probably 4 to 6 years, but notably in your time when you were still serving, started really in 2007, where the pursuit of counter space capabilities was, I think, made everybody aware of the potential changes in the character of conflict moving forward. It's with that lens and the task in the National Defense Strategy that the Secretary and the CSO have postured both the Air Force and the Space Force for what we call great power competition. And that is a desire to improve our posture for how we generate, provide, and ultimately build out combat power for this nation. And frankly, that's where SpOC's sweet spot is right now as Space Operations Command. A couple of things happened very quickly as I took command. One was, in the past, my predecessor, General Whiting, who's now the commander of the United States Space Command, the Combatant Command, was the service component commander to U.S. Spacecom. Quickly around the time that I took command, we calved that off and focused a dedicated service component under the command of Lieutenant General Doug Shess, the commander of U.S. Space Force's Spacecom out at Vandenberg, to do that. What that allowed my command to do was really focus on our primary lines of effort. I think my predecessor would have told you that he generates, presents, and sustains space power for the nation. I added an I because the task was to improve. The timelines that whether it is where we want to be in developing our capability, where we see potential adversaries, both the acute threat we see in Russia and Europe, as well as President Xi's last year reaffirmation of 2027 as a potential timeline to have his military achieve the capability to have an option to take Taiwan, have led us to look at our timelines for development and say, well, what do we want from Space Operations Command? And my discussion with the Secretary and the Service Chief, there's 3 things they want. The first is to generate combat-ready space power for America and our allies, just as you said. The task is to improve it now based off the capabilities we have and rapidly spiral in as much capability as we can get. The second piece is to provide that space power to all the combatant commands, not just U.S. Space Command. That means to source, coordinate, and prioritize recommendations back through the Service Chief and the Secretary for how we would shape tailored presentation of forces. Not what we just did in the past when I was a crew commander in combat crews, but now in the future, how do we shape those forces? And I'll talk to you more about that. The final piece was, and you saw this as the Commander Air Force Space Command, was to improve our advocacy. Typically, and our acquisition professionals have done a marvelous job of building capability for us. But typically, we'd get involved about 18 months out from operational acceptance in terms of the operational combat force. As you know, sir, as a former programmer, that's too late. If we're going to have an effective advocacy, and I've been designated as the combat forces proponent, we need to be building in the warfighter's voice from the first force design all the way through the program to what is funded, and then finally into operational acceptance and fielding. Can't wait till the end. Too many choices have been made. And that was frankly one of the reasons why when I was a young crew commander, one of the victims of the growth of the service program and the budget was the training suite. And we came online without any effective way to train our guardians. We can't let that happen anymore. So those are really the three hats that I have, is to generate, provide, and advocate for combat-ready space power for the nation. Now, I do that in partnership with all the other combatant commands, or excuse me, the other field commands, but also with the service component commanders who we're starting to build out. A couple of years ago, you'll recall, we established Indo-Pacific Command as the first. We are since started to build those out in other areas of responsibility, and I know that's something we can talk more about later.
Great.
Yeah.
That's good. So General Mastelaar out in Indo-PACOM
Exactly right.
was the first one to stand up, I believe.
Exactly right.
Good. So
And he's doing a great job. He has a demand signal on behalf of his boss, Admiral Paparo.
Who's got choke on over him.
Exactly.
He's right across, he's sitting in his building.
And that's the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Is we have built out as we normalize, really that's been the CSO number two's focus, is normalize how we present combat power in the service combatant, in the combatant commands through our service components, one of his focus areas. I think what you'll see is all of the combatant commands have an enormous appetite. The demand for space power, and you can see it in current conflicts like you see in the Ukraine. You can see it in the Chinese military power report that the DIA releases every year. The demand for space power, either to see, shoot, move, and communicate better at a pace, speed, and precision for our forces that outpaces any adversary, or the need to deny that same advantage for anybody who's looking to do that to our joint forces or our combined forces. That's what the nation expects of the Space Force, and that's what I'm focused on.
Fantastic. That's great. So if I was going to, because I think a big part of folks understanding the organization and the structure of the Space Force is some of it's been evolving, as you pointed out, and we have new names for things. So let me kind of read back to you what I heard with regard to your job. Back when there was an Air Force Space Command, the headquarters job was to organize, train, and equip Space Forces.
Exactly right.
And that's what you do.
Primary focus, day to day.
Primary focus, okay. And so part of that you mentioned is the Space Force Gen model. Can you talk a little bit more about what that term means to our audience, please?
Absolutely. Every military service has a force generation model, and that is the way they develop, prepare, and ultimately present capability for the combatant commanders. That may manifest itself in a number of ways. In the Army, it may be a deploy to dwell timeline, and they ramp up their units all the way through large force exercises and presentation. You may see a different model in the United States Navy as they build in a combined composite task force, principally focused on a carrier, but also on amphibious ships sometimes as well. We're no different. That what I saw when I came into this job was that I think we were missing a couple of things in our development overall of the force. And that was primarily a recognition that none of these capabilities were designed to operate independently. It's an integrated warfighting team. So what we've done is a couple of things. In the organization of the force, we have integrated into our combat squadrons, which is what I present to General Chess, or as the case may be, may present to General Mastelier. We integrate the space, ISR, and cyber capabilities into one team. We provide them a mission planning element that allows them to look across the force for what their needs are, anticipate mission type orders from the component commander or combatant commander, and ultimately coordinate how they might best respond to those. And then we also provide them a mission support element. And what that does is allow them access to the installation capabilities that are so fundamental to execute our mission, whether that's security forces for force protection, whether that's civil engineering for power, HVAC and cooling. They need access to that because we fight from our installations.
Right.
So we organize differently. We also chose to train them differently. In the past, you might see an individual unit focus their training model on executing a mission essential task list that was fundamentally about baselining their capability to operate a system. That's no more. It is primarily focused on the threat. And there's different phases of their training. They train as a unit. They will also train across their mission area. So we have deltas, O6 commands that are built around mission areas. Orbital warfare is one. Electromagnetic warfare is another. Missile warning and tracking a third, and so on. So they now integrate and train as a mission area. The commander, I was just at Buckley last week visiting Delta 4, a missile warning and tracking mission area. The commander there is a guy named Colonel Bobby Schmidt. He now trains, it's not just SBIRS training in 2 Swiss. He's training across the formation, across their ground-based radars, to track things like hypersonic vehicles better, to focus on potential fractional orbital bombardment system capabilities like the PRC have been building better. So he's training as a mission area. The final top off in their last month before we present them to the combatant commands is they train as an integrated warfighting team. And we focus on planning across formations. If Bobby Schmidt is going to protect SBIRS 6 from a potential on-orbit ASAT, he's going to rely on space domain awareness data provided by Delta 2. He's going to rely on ISR information provided by Delta 7, our intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance Delta. He may rely in the future on orbital warfare capabilities provided by Delta 9. That was the seam in the past. Now it's an integrated warfighting team training together. And then the final piece we did is we equipped them differently. Is we are focusing on providing shared awareness capabilities so that everybody sees the battle space the same. We're also focused on spiraling out new capability and combat enhancements. And as I am designated the executive agent for weapon system sustainment, we're allowed to and able to now push directly in one single chain of command the improvements and sustainment of those capabilities at a much more rapid pace. We've seen good improvements in that so far, not just in making sure we can sustain better, but spiral in new capability in a couple of places. I think that could be a big thing for us in the future. So if you look at my 3 roles, organize, train, and equip, we're doing all 3 of them differently in our 4th generation model to make sure that that end state that a combatant commander receives is exactly what she or he needs, tailored to their required mission set. And I think that's a big improvement for where we've been.
It sounds terrific, particularly integrating all those things into one element. So
Yes,
you can envision an adversary targeting a SBIRS satellite, as you pointed out, and a lot of things have to happen immediately. I mean, there's defensive maneuvers the satellite system operators can take. There may be defensive systems in that orbit that can be brought to bear simultaneously, all kinds of different things, and that has to happen rather quickly, correct?
Right, exactly. So you're talking in the past, things that people thought would be this, I got hours or days to prepare for this. Not how we're training to standard now.
Right.
That's not what Admiral Paparo needs for assured missile warning and tracking in the Pacific.
Right.
This is a seconds to minutes requirement. And those are the performance standards for advanced training that you'll see developed and put in place now that maybe in the past, we just had a unit focused model. I think that's the power is we call it, our principal purpose of our model for 4th generation is to integrate and aggregate combat ready space power. And I think we only done it one time. So the first 6 months we're learning, but they went into presentation on the 1st of July, first time ever, a synchronized presentation of space power to combatant commanders. Has never happened before. Every unit went in together. They trained together. They were prepared together. They know their names. We got unprecedented access to special access capabilities for so many of the crew members. In the past, that was a barrier to integration, as they didn't have the clearance.
It was.
So we have now started to break those barriers down, almost 1,000 more billet access for special access programs, thanks to things the Secretary, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of Defense have focused on. So we've got smarter people who are more aware of the threat. They're more familiar with the capabilities that they need to integrate with. They're building the habits needed to train, but also plan together. And as we improve our test and training infrastructure, they're going to be able to train just like you would have at Red Flag. They're going to have models for integrated warfighting team for evolutions and training that we only dreamed about when I was a crew commander.
Well, that was going to be my next question. I mean, I think one of the big misconceptions about space in the past, when we tried to compare a space unit to, let's say, an air unit, is the air units, they're training all the time, and then when things happen, they go.
Yeah.
The space units were operating all the time because there was no training, really. It
Right.
was, you got checked out on the console and you were doing shift work. There were no simulators. There was nothing to go off and war game with in the past. There weren't enough people to give people time off to train if they had something to train with, which they didn't. So can you talk a little bit about some of the training capabilities that you're advocating for to allow our operators in each of the squadrons, if you will, to, when they're not on console day in and day out, they're training for either malfunctions or warfighting scenarios or whatever?
Yeah. So, and I want to go back to one point you made, because that was a key limiter in the past, is the schedule to operate 24/7 almost drove everything else.
Right.
So rather being, form following function in how we organized, we really organized our training around, hey, we got to build a 24/7 mission. So what we did was really focus in on what it takes to build that time into the calendar. So right now, prior to commit, which is about 105 days of when every combat crew will be presented to a combatant command, they have a 6-week dedicated time period focused on training. And they'll focus on that unit, mission area, and integrated warfighting team training, through that time. What we've seen in a couple areas of where we've seen, I think, goodness, but also need for improvement is in a few things. The first is right now, we don't have the emulation capability for the threat and the simulation capability across units to allow us to train at the high fidelity levels that we will need to. I'll be honest with you, much of that training will likely be very sensitive, and we would not want to expose that in a live fly arena. So it's going to probably have to be virtual. That's not stopping us. We are walking through tabletop exercises, threat academics, planning iterations and charrettes, and we do some exercises already, primarily with the support of our STARCOM teammates and Tim Shaba's folks, that allow us to get the mission area focus right in one set of exercises and training venues. And then we bring everybody together prior to commit in what we call our flashpoint, which is our last look exercise. In between there's a 3-week space flag we do every 6 months. We have to build the fidelity I just described to you in those emulation, simulation, and threat models. And we have to build them so that they can integrate across missions. In the past, because of the way the sustainment was focused, the training improvements were only laser focused on a training suite inside one particular weapon system. I got 68 major weapon systems in SpOC. We need to train across weapon systems so that they can plan together, execute a plan based off the mission type orders, example from General Chess, fight for that day or two as the case may be, and then fully debrief it to come back with solutions of where they can get better. That is how the joint force fights, and that's the direction we're headed. We have those built into our training pipeline every 6 months now. We're going to get better, but the lack of, please don't be mistaken, the lack of emulation and simulation tools is not stopping these Guardians from going, and they're integrating with their airmen on those installations at a level that's unprecedented as well.
Great, and I'm glad to hear that you're also carving out time for warfighting scenarios or war games, if you will, right, so they can do it. It's every how often did you say it?
So the space flags are at least once every 6 months.
Okay.
We're trying to build those into a more rapid pace, but those are 3-week evolutions. So they'll come in together, get cleared for a day or two. You got to remember, at many of my installations, some of them, the facilities that they have, if they have a SCIF, it's a very small room. So a sensitive compartmentalized information facility. What we've got to do is bring a place where they can plan together at the highest classification level in a very controlled environment and get access to both all of the intel on the threat, but also all the capabilities we can bring to bear. And that is why it takes 3 weeks as they get together, understand and get briefed to a common standard, coordinate mission type orders. Now we're going to include our C2 nodes in the future. And then they plan and execute for a full 7 to 10 days and have a couple of days left to debrief to take those lessons learned back. My concern right now is getting the fidelity there, but also getting the capacity there so I can get every Guardian who's going to go into commit into that cycle. Right now, we're probably at about a 10% of that force, so it's representative. It's not as comprehensive as I'd like it to be. So.
Okay, we've been or at least I've been kind of focusing or listening to your comments with regard to the different squadrons. What about at the command and control level at General Chess's level?
Yeah.
A concern I always had in the past was that was a single point of operational control.
Yeah.
And just like in the squadron, that organization had no place to train. If there was going to be a war game and you needed that component to be training at the same time, doing their day-to-day operations,
Yep.
there was no place to go and
Right.
do that. There was no training facility for the operational level of war fighter. Is that something you're trying to attack as well, or have you solved that problem?
So solved would be a strong word. I think getting better would be where we are.
Okay.
In the first combat training cycle, which led up to the 1 July presentation, we focused on integrating the combat squadrons, which is what you were talking about. And we went off of the operational plan that is General Chess's component plan for how he sees the fight in the future. So we're training to General Chess's standards directly.
Got it.
Where we are going to improve in the future, in the next cycle, is actually bring in our C2 nodes, as I mentioned earlier. So you'll see representatives from Delta 5, which is out of Vandenberg, and Delta 15, the National Space Defense Center, a part of that training evolution. They'll have the opportunity to build the mission type order that goes to the combat squadrons. They'll also have the ability to practice force direction as a part of that employment. So I see those opportunities only increasing in the future. I think the model that it's important to note in the Air Force, as a former member of an AOC in the Pacific,
Right.
our model was centralized control and decentralized execution. The model that we execute is more akin to the Navy, and it's focused on mission command. And that is General Chess or any component commander providing their priority tasks to their combat formations, acceptable levels of risk, rules of engagement, and any constraints and restraints for operations they have. And then the combat force subsequently plans themselves and figures out a way to achieve those objectives. The level of control, awareness, day-to-day focus of the air domain, we do not have that in space, if you know what I mean. We don't have the surveillance sensors that provide near ubiquitous awareness of anything flying over a given area of responsibility. We don't have the theater air control system in place like you'd see maybe in an AOC as a supporting element. So our primary sensors are the Space Surveillance Network, as you know. You help build some of those sensors. And they are based off of episodic views of a domain and not constant awareness. That is one key limiter that will constrain the ability to have a detailed level of control, and you must empower those guardians to come up with independent solutions. Another thing and opportunity I see is those mission planning elements. For the first time at the tactical level, they're able to coordinate amongst themselves and figure out innovative ways to come up with solutions back to the C2 node. I think that has already borne fruit. We have seen the development of credible tactics, techniques, and procedures to defeat threats on orbit in just the last 6 months. Then that's unleashing the guardians and the young people who have ideas and not constraining them in the past with what we might have seen, which required a lot of direction, more akin to what I saw when I was in the ICBM force. And I think that's just not the level of focus and the methodology for C2 in the future of Space Forces.
Okay, but let me pull on that a little bit. Well, first, let's talk about General Chess's responsibility, his organization, who is now called, I think, Space Forces Space.
Yep.
And my interpretation is that he is the space component to U.S. Space Command.
Absolutely.
So, and of course, U.S. Space Command, to your point about situational awareness, the past commander, and I'm sure General Whiting's no different, their number one priority was to increase their situational awareness of the domain. So, you know, hopefully one day it'll be like air where you have a little better picture than we have today, episodic as you described. I think it's a good way to describe it. But in the meantime, U.S. Space Command commander is going to turn to General Chess and say, I need these effects. Right? This is my strategy. This is what I want you to accomplish. Give me a plan.
Right.
And General Chess is then going to be the war fighter for U.S. to support U.S. Space Command.
Absolutely.
Okay. And so that's what Space Forces Space means.
Exactly right.
Okay.
And he also coordinates across the other components, just like any other component commander in a combatant command.
Okay. So all of your forces you will present to U.S. Space Command.
Not all of them.
Okay, through general chefs was the rest of my question. So explain that to our
bet.
audience. Yeah.
So there are missions and assigned forces. One of my roles, as I mentioned to you, is the force provider, to help provide priority recommendations to the secretary and the service chief of how we would meet that demand signal from all the combatant commands. So at any given time, there are requirements for force assignment or force allocation to all the combatant commands. You mentioned General Mastelier. So Admiral Paparo has a demand signal for in-theater forces. We will typically present those in the form of combat detachments. And those typically in the past have been around our defensive electronic warfare mission, you may recall, operation called Bounty Hunter.
Right.
Those are examples of forces that you would see allocated to, not to General Chess directly maybe, but allocated to a combatant commander forward.
Indo-PACOM. And then
URAF in Europe. So they get access to those. The employed in place forces operate in most of our day-to-day missions that you might recall that provide support to all the combatant commanders is what gets to General Chess. That's the preponderance of the units that we give forward to any presentation model. And he gets, 90+% of the force elements go to General Chess for presentation. And then as supported and supporting relationships are developed or if the need is no longer there, they'll let go. He manages in coordination with the other components on behalf of the combatant commanders how he would meet those requirements for the other combatant commands. But he's my principal customer. General Chess is. I mean, he is the main person I give capability to in the form of those combat squadrons, which is that integration of space, ISR, cyber, mission planning, and mission support capability all under a single commander.
Okay, and so I think what I heard you say is there will be some forces or capabilities that will be retained by you and not chopped. ACC does that. They have retained forces for combat command. They chop some to a combatant commander as by direction of the Secretary of Defense as conflicts or arise. Can you describe what you might retain and that relationship between you and those forces?
Sure. An example of capability that is retained would be our ISR forces, for example. So our intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance squadrons. We stood up 2 new squadrons over the past year. The 75th ISRS is focused on targeting, and the 76th is focused on exploitation of capability. I don't have enough ISR forces to give every combatant commander one, and all of them need those capabilities. Moreover, some of their primary focus is on executing service missions as well. So we do ISR, as you know, to support acquisition. We do ISR to support TTP development and tactics analysis and so on. So as we look through what forces need to be presented or retained, and this is the calculus we go through with the combatant commands and with the joint staff, is ISR squadrons are an example of something that I'm not going to give all of that to a single combatant commander because frankly, it's there to support all of them. And the best model is it also supports service missions as well. So what we do is, and this is part of the force provider role, is you get requirements from every combatant commander of what those needs are. We prioritize those based off of a framework that we have, either in support of the Joint Staff directly through direction, or based off of national defense priority. And then we do what we can to meet those requirements, either in targeted teams that might be providing support, or based off of a level of effort. So targeting is an example. We do analysis of targets that will be associated with space or counter space activity on a day-to-day basis. And that's what that 75th ISR targeting squadron focuses on.
So for example of that target might be, we know that our adversaries have ground-based lasers.
Exactly right.
So targeting analysis for that.
Targeting analysis of that. Assessments of which capabilities are focused on targeting U.S. or allied forces. And what those networks looks like and how that C4 ISR architecture is built.
And how it can be disrupted.
Exactly right.
Okay.
Every combatant commander has those requirements. So in that case, we prioritize that weight of effort based off of internal prioritization we have consistent with the Joint Staff. And then we see where we can provide support to the maximum extent we can.
Great.
You got to remember, for space, I think the number I saw, a perfect example was, in the United States Navy, I think there's almost 4 dozen fighter squadrons focused on providing operations from carriers, mostly the F-18 transitioning to the F-35. For every mission in space, we got 1 squadron. So the notion that we can break every one of those squadrons up into small pieces and give them to every combatant commander, we'd have nothing left to constitute. So we have to have models that allow us to meet 24/7 mission requirements while simultaneously surging to the needs and demands of combatant commanders. And I think that's the value of Space Operations Command being the force provider. We'll have a first ever sourcing and prioritization conference with all of the combatant commanders as well as our allies and the interagency in October. All those requirements will come in. We'll level set on the capacity that we have, including modernization that we might need to take forces down in order to build new capability, and then build a plan for the future that goes out at least 2 to 3 years. And we're going to refresh on that every 6 months. I think that's the way you would have seen it maybe in Fleet Forces Command, the United States Navy, or in Army Forces Command. We're using a different model, but it's fundamentally accomplishing the same objectives.
Okay. As you talk about one squadron that's supporting the whole globe and whatever, missile warning or GPS, whatever. And that squadron is going to be taking orders in time of near conflict or conflict from U.S. Space Command through General Chess to that squadron.
Most of them, for sure.
Yeah. And what about when there's the case that, well, those orders are going to break the organization? Where do you fit into this? And the reason I ask this, as a former U-2 wing commander, we had units, small units deployed all over the world that were chopped. On the other hand, the folks that were directing those units didn't understand completely the constraints on U-2 operations, physiological constraints on the pilots, the timelines, our pipeline of supplies, et cetera, et cetera. And so we always had to kind of keep an eye on to make sure they didn't break the force that we had given them to utilize. Not that they weren't great warfighters, that they just didn't understand U-2s. And that, my sense, is going to be a bit of the case with space. Great warfighters with lots of demands, lots of requirements, but don't break the organization. Is this something you think about?
Oh, absolutely. So in the force generation model, prior to even me going back to the service chief in this case, me and General Space spent an afternoon together, and I worked through with him every combat squadron he was getting, what their mission essential tasks and focus were, and where we trained and optimized them to be ready for. So he had a clear expectation of what he was getting. If, in the case you described, a task comes from the combatant command that looks like it's beyond the capacity of the unit to achieve, or we get concerned about a risk to force. The goodness now is that we have an independent voice to have that discussion with General Chess to say, this is more than we can provide. Or maybe we can do that. Let me come back with an opportunity of how we might be able to get that done. So you got to remember, and this is the brilliance of it's not stated enough. Those combat squadrons that were given to General Chess, in almost every case, that combat squadron commander is a captain. So the bulk of the force generation squadron, the balance of that unit that's not presented, that's in some form of prepare or ready prior to commit, is held by that force generation squadron commander. The 2 Swiss commander, my boss, General Weinstein Colonel Weinstein at the time was my squadron commander. So every time one of those tasks come in, if that combat squadron commander feels like she or he can't meet those needs, or that's a task that's beyond their mandate or writ or what they've been trained to do, they got backstop.
They're the top cover.
They got top cover to come back to say, boss, I think this exceeds the requirement. And there's a methodology. I check the recurring readiness of those units every day, and I can see what the taskings are. And trust me, my relationship with General Chess is so tight, if he even had a hint, if he felt like there was something that was beyond the mission essential tasks that they've been trained to standard to, he would let me know. But even if it came up, I think we've got a relationship and a process where I can go back and say, hey, I think we can do that. Let me come back to you with what that force offering needs to look like. But that's the power of having a dedicated force provider. We didn't have that in the past. The force provider for Space Forces in the past was exclusively U.S. Space Command. I did it as the J3 in my last job. Now the service needs to have its own voice. And the voice is, I know the capability and capacity of this force. We are best postured to provide recommendations of how we source combatant commander requirements, particularly those that are the most stressing.
Very good. I guess one other point on that, or example perhaps, that I'll put on the table, and you can say good example or bad, is moving of
I'm sure it's going to be great.
Moving of comm satellites to the geosynchronous orbit. And the risk to force is you move them too much, they run out of gas, they don't have the lifespan that you would want.
Mhm.
The other side of it is depends, if the risk is a direct to send ASAT or some other threat, co-orbital threat to that particular asset. That has to be balanced.
Absolutely.
And so you have a voice in that balance as your.
We do. Now, be clear, the Secretary of Defense is the ultimate arbiter of what's
Right.
assigned or not to a combatant commander. And once he makes that decision to present that capability, our opportunities to go back to the combatant command, they're there. But it's General Whiting's, in this case, your example for SATCOM is all presented to General Whiting. They're General Whiting's forces. What we are working on, though, is tailored force elements that allow us time and opportunity to modernize. As you know, we are taking a new approach as opposed to a single orbit at which we provide narrowband, wideband, or protected satellite communications. It's going to be a new approach in the future. Multiple orbits, as opposed to single-digit numbers of satellites. You're talking dozens to hundreds of satellites, provided from multiple platforms and with different capability. That single-digit numbering of what was presented in the past is old think. What we need to do is argue this is the combat capability that makes up satellite communication in the future, or data relay, as the case may be. And then within that margin, work with General Chess to say, this part is in the process of it needs to be optimized. It needs to be modernized. We need new software updates. As you get to an era of software-defined radios, tailored mission requirements come up. Those are things that I think is the value, again, of a force provider having that conversation first with the COCOM, who has the requirement. In this case, most of it is for General Whiting and General Chess. And then making sure that we're mindful of the impacts on the rest of the joint force, and that the actions across the force are well understood. My view, we're in the best position to do that on behalf of the Secretary and the Service Chief and Space Operations Command. Why? Because I'm focused on that every day. I'm no longer trying to also be the component commander to employ it and operate it day to day. I'm strictly focused on generating and providing and advocating for that combat force day to day.
Terrific. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
There's another new term out there that we're talking about. It's called integrated mission deltas.
You bet.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely.
What is different about that, and what's the strength of that organizational construct? What gap is it filling?
I think that if you talk to the Secretary and the Service Chief, I think there'd be two gaps that it really addressed. One was just from a good military standpoint, the principal components of readiness, personnel, equipment, supply and sustainment, training, were divided up amongst multiple field commands. The sustainment in particular in the past was provided through the System Program Office in SSC, Space Systems Command. And so I think one of the key things, if you talk to General Saltzman in particular, he'd say, hey, that just doesn't square with my military mind that the commander responsible for generating and providing the combat capability to a combatant commander doesn't have control over the sustainment and resourcing of that capability to either fix it if it's broken or to pace upgrades as needed to meet the threat as it evolves. And so I think that was one. I think the second thing was we didn't integrate in that single formation all of the elements that we think are principal focus areas for the presentation of forces. We focused on the space squadrons. We didn't integrate into those deltas the ISR squadron or detachment or the cyber unit. So those are the two things we did with integrated mission deltas. Is number one is we streamline the chain of command, and we say that the sustainment function and the capability to ensure the ability to both repair if needed, but also to a limited extent, improve the combat capability as spiral upgrades are coming in, are under the control of a single commander.
Yeah.
The Delta commander in this case,
okay.
the Delta commander under me.
Okay.
The additional thing was we gave him an ISR squadron or the unit and a cyber unit to defend his forces integrated into the formation. We've done it in two places so far. The first was in PNT or NAVWAR. Colonel Andy Mentioner is the IMD or Integrated Mission Delta Commander there. And the other place was in Space Electromagnetic Warfare, and that's Colonel Petrucci is the IMD Commander there. We have had a number of discussions with the Secretary. I think he has seen the goodness. I'll give you a couple of examples. We had an anomaly on one of our newer birds that we had launched in PNT, and because Andy Menschner had the ISR unit to actually focus on the threat right then, and the capability to work the sustainment and fixes to that, was able to fix something in hours that might have taken days in the past. Simultaneously, he's responsible for integrating OCX, which is the new command and control platform for GPS. So he is bounding the force available to provide for that while integrating new capability as OCX comes online. He's got a clearer picture of the mission need. And so he's able to make more informed choices about where he can take risk or not. I think he'd tell you that that's one of the key areas where he has found a level of speed and capacity that he just didn't have when he was just the senior material leader. And the last piece I'll tell you is, you got to remember, we integrate in this formation, not just the space ISR and cyber operators, but also the acquisition professionals as well. So this is a line where that IMD commander, who should have a vice commander who's also a colonel, either she or he, one of those positions, will have that line back to the PEO, so we never break that chain back to Mr. Calvelli and back up through the secretary for acquisition. And also that we don't get ourselves in a place where the operations is driving acquisition. We need to allow for combat mission needs and requirements to be clarified, but also an opportunity to close on those solutions while respecting the PEO chain. I talked to Mr. Calvelli about this last week. I think he is excited about integrated mission deltas. We're in the process of going through the next set of what those will be. I think my hope is that over the next year, we will complete the transition of all the deltas that need to be integrated mission deltas into IMDs in the next 12 months. That's my hope.
Great.
And we're
that should speed things up, and that's the idea.
It's not just speeding it up, it's improving the capacity and the lethality of the system. There are operating concepts, I'll give you an example, for electromagnetic warfare that we think are very promising, that allow us to meet more combatant commander needs with a forward-based capability and leveraging an infrastructure back home. If Colonel Petrucci can't control the sustainment and upgrade for combat enhancement of those weapon systems, we'll never get there. All we do is spiral out what we started with originally. So this allows an operational commander in the chain of command to see what the requirement is for force generation and upgrade as needed the combat enhancements needed, but also fixes on the right time and tempo in order to meet those needs. And I think that's something that we just haven't had before. And it's produced a lot of goodness already.
Great, great. We've used the word requirements quite a bit today. Certainly the combatant commander has requirements.
All of them do.
Traditionally, the knock on a combatant commander's requirements are that he or she is focused on the next 3 years, not 15 years, where the service organizations are looking 15 years out at developing and meeting requirements for the future, a little more farsighted. I've never agreed with that in space because things took so long and it was, but in any case, you've got a combatant commander. You've got you as a force provider, you help write requirements, I'm assuming, as well for the future. And then we have Space Futures Command. Okay, talk to me a little bit about where the lanes are in requirements development between those three organizations, yourself, the combatant commander, and Space Futures Command.
You bet. So I think the easy answer here is Congress helped us out a little bit on this one. And, there's legislation that describes the Chief of Space Operations role as the DoD integrator for space requirements. So the real approval of warfighting requirements and coordination back to the Joint Staff for vetting in the JROC must go through the service chief and the service chief staff. So I can have all the designs I want, and so can the combatant commanders. We got to ultimately go through there. But to your specific question of how Space Futures Command fits, the gap that command is filling is in a few areas in particular. Number one, we needed an arm or an element, in this case, a major field command, to focus on defining the future operating environment. What's the threat going to look like 10 to 15 years from now? What are the technology threat vectors that we see that are most promising to be able to counter that threat? Where do we think other mission partners might be 10 to 15 years from now? And then begin to have within a single chain of authority the wargaming, technology development and prioritization and capacity to design a force for the future. So I see Space Futures Command as fundamentally designing the future force for the Secretary and the Service Chief. Necessarily, they will, as a part of that design, come up with requirements or gaps that they think need to be filled. The process to document and formalize requirements is the same as it was, sir, when you were. We still go through the Joint Requirements Oversight Council to make sure that those are vetted appropriately. But the good part now, I think, and with the benefit of having a service is you have this role of the CSO to look at all of those requirements that come in. And that service chief can say, look, I think these 3 things, the best way to do that is this final requirement, not 3 different looks at it depending on your 2 to 3 year horizon, maybe as a combatant commander. So I think big R requirements, I'll call it, stays at the headquarters.
Okay.
I certainly will and have provided my input on combat mission needs and requirements. I have had the good fortune of being able to vet those and discuss those both with my service chief, but also I've had conversations with the service acquisition executive about where I see the key requirements. Those are come up through the chain of command through our deltas and our squadrons as they are seeing things happen day to day. What can they focus on in order to improve our capability and capacity in the future? And I think certainly Futures Command is going to have a role, but you got to remember that epic that they're focused on is outside the program. They're largely, that 5 to 15 year horizon. They're building Space Force 2040 or something. Okay. That's important because, frankly, if you don't have a true star, a North Star or a vision of where you want to head, almost any road will get you there. So having a single agency responsible for that force design on behalf of the Secretary and the Service Chief, I think is going to be huge for us. I think the Space Warfighting Analysis Center did a phenomenal job at mission area design as we've gone through different mission areas, EW, orbital warfare, COM, and so on in the past. And they'll continue to be a part of it, but they'll also be a wargaming center.
Right.
There'll also be science and technology and innovation as a part of this Space Futures Command. So I think all the component parts that they need to be looking towards the future and building what that operating environment will be, I think is all in there. I think we just got to fill it out and build it.
That's great. One of the concerns I've had, and I've heard from people with new ideas in the contractor community, they'll come with an idea or something that might fulfill a requirement. And the answer is, if it doesn't solve my 2027 problem of China maybe invading Taiwan, I'm not interested. Well, China might not invade in 2027, but they might in 2030. And if you haven't invested in the future beyond that short-term need, whether it's developing the right requirements or funding those capabilities that the far out-looking service and Futures Command is thinking about, then we can find ourselves in trouble 5 or 10 years from now because we are too short-sighted. Yeah,
I think I'm a fan of Goldwater Nichols in that way. I like the organization that incentivizes one chain of command focused on operations in the next couple of years, while simultaneously has the service chiefs and the joint chiefs in particular focused on ensuring that the force has a look beyond that. And I think there's a good tension and balance there. As I'll be honest with you, it's good design. Where you stand is where you sit. Right. And as the J3, I was almost never happy with what the Space Force was doing for me, not because they didn't want to, but because I wanted it faster, meaner, quicker, lethal, everything now. As the guy who's generating the force, by extension, and providing it, also developing the force for where we need to be in potential range of conflicts, there's a good balance there. And I think that the opportunity that we have with a service now, where you have a single service chief as a member of the Joint Chiefs, able to, in the initial development of orders that might go down to COCOMs, new operating concepts, the joint warfighting concept being developed, he's at the table for all of these meetings, and he's able to balance what you're talking about is this tension between risk to mission today and risk to the force in the future. He's able to balance that, I think, a lot better. But also, we've got a COCOM who's constantly focused on this threat day to day. And because it is changing so rapidly, and because space in many ways for people is just hard to think through for a lot of the folks in the American people, but also the Joint Force, I think that's good to have that COCOM there as well. Great. Yeah.
I've got one last question, then we'll go to our audience. Yeah. You mentioned earlier you fight from your home bases.
You bet.
Years ago, there was a move for efficiencies when the Cold War was over, quote unquote, to say, well, we're going to save money and we'll just take our electrical power for our bases from the commercial grid. And today, the commercial grid is at risk from our adversaries.
Yeah.
And so that's just one point with regard to infrastructure needs as we think about the cyber domain and the threats to just general infrastructure in the United States and how that could impact our military forces' ability to deploy, or in your case, continue to operate
Exactly right.
at your home bases. What are your infrastructure needs today? Because that's part of your responsibility as well, right?
Yeah.
From an organized, trained, equipped perspective.
Yep. That's a great question. I think it's fair to say that the Department of Defense, largely across all of the military services, is focused on infrastructure. For me, the base is actually weapon system infrastructure.
Right.
It's not a place that we come back to. So in many ways, the installation needs to take the marks of a realization that it is a weapon system, that the force protection capability that I have in order to have a layered defense from potential attacks in the future has a focus like a weapon system, that my power, to your point, has a focus like a weapon system. That means that I have got primary alternative contingency options to provide that power. Mm-hmm. It's not just power. HVAC for us is life. If you can't keep all of the network infrastructure cool, mm-hmm. particularly in some of the places we operate in, you know where they are, sir. Or in the case of Peak, heated, right. We'll never be able to operate from these locations. So we've taken a view that weapon system infrastructure and our installations are fundamentally part of our weapon system. And I have begun to, as the Space Operations Command Commander, prioritize those in a way that I think gets after those needs. But I will tell you this, as part of our fourth generation cycle, we're exercising every component of our weapon system to include the installations. So now we will go through exercises where power has been disrupted or degraded. We will have an opportunity for the Guardians and Airmen associated with that, whether that's the Civil Engineering Squadron in this case, or partnerships with off-base agencies, whether emergency services or other, can provide those. We just wrapped up one at Buckley just a few weeks ago. So we're not just taking an approach of resourcing it better, which is a specific ask for me. And we've got some needs that are fundamental, I think, to sustaining operations in a contested environment in the future. We're also taking an approach of training at a level of integration between our airmen and Guardians that allows them to see, here's what this failure modes could look like, and here's how rapidly we think we can restore it. That's another benefit of a new fourth generation model. It's not just about the Guardians, the airmen, half of my command is airmen. Mm-hmm. There's 12,000 plus people in Space Operations Command. Half of them are airmen. Mm-hmm. And they are man in the gates, man in the Civil Engineering Squadron, providing force support to our families and our military community. They're not just there out of the goodness of their heart. They're there because the space missions matter to the Secretary of the nation that much that we need to protect it and provide support to it. We're exercising all of that in our fourth generation model, and I think it's going to only grow in the future. There's an exercise in August where we're going to see force protection in a new light and starting to look at integration across the joint force of how we look at protecting space and space capabilities in the future. I won't go into more details than that, but I think that these are huge opportunities, and I think the Joint Force has leaned in to this as a challenge, and it's something that I think will resonate, particularly as we look to resource it in the future.
Great. Well, once again, I've asked too many questions, and there's very little time left. But
sorry about that.
Why don't we? This has been a great conversation, but Aidan, can you see if we have any questions from our audience that General Miller could address for the remainder of our time?
Sure. First, we have a question from Greg Hadley of Air and Space Forces magazine.
Okay.
Hi, General. Thanks for doing this. My question was on the integrated mission delta transition that you mentioned. You said kind of all that need to be transitioned will hopefully be done in the next 12 months. Can you clarify what you mean by need to be and how many deltas need to be IMDs?
Yep. I think that's a good question. So in missions where we are providing capability as part of the combat force, either presented or sustained, where we need to integrate those three mission capabilities of space, cyber, and ISR, I think you'll see those as potential candidates for integrated mission deltas. So For me, give you an example, missile warning and tracking. Obviously, we want to integrate the space, ISR, and cyber capability that's focused on protecting not just the space-based infrared system and overhead, but also our ground-based radars and the infrastructure there. That's obviously a good candidate for an integrated mission delta. My cyber delta, that is Delta 6, or my ISR delta, that is Delta 7, support providing either a function or a force element into the future integrated mission deltas. I'm not sure that those need to be integrated mission deltas. That doesn't mean that they don't need to grow in the future and that there's not capacity or capability that we owe them in order to improve their readiness and particularly what they offer the joint force. It just means that I think primarily you'll see it focused on areas where we are providing or presenting capability to the joint force commanders, either directly as a presentation of a force element or service retained. And then we will see the integration of the space, cyber, and ISR functions, as well as the sustainment functions under a single commander. I think in just a couple of deltas, and I mentioned two in particular, that I'm not sure they would be IMDs in the traditional sense. I'm not taking space out of another delta to put it into the ISR delta as an example, but we are looking at what the component structure of an ISR delta is in the future. For example, I've talked with General Chilton about our targeting squadron. As the programmer, I was the one who laid in the requirements to build that squadron. I know that I don't have enough capability there to meet all the needs of the combatant commanders. I think there's growth in some of those missions in particular. I just don't know that they need to be integrated mission deltas. Hopefully that answers your question, Greg.
Thank you.
Next, we have a written question from Amy Garcia. She asks, as the Space Development Agency starts to move from Tranche 0 to Tranche 1 in terms of its fielding of the proliferated satellite architecture, what lessons is SpOC starting to take when it comes to operating these larger, more proliferated constellations?
I think we are taking them, but learning them as we go. And I actually have a discussion with Derek, I think this week actually, on what those elements will look like that ultimately get provided or presented to combatant commanders. I think a couple of things in particular. Number one is the resilience that's offered and the speed at which Derek and the team have been able to start to field some of these capabilities has been impressive. So there'll be new models and operating concepts for employing in the first tranches of capability, largely focused on missile warning, missile tracking, and there's also some comm and data relay capability that we're focused on initially. They provide potentially game-changing effects in a contested environment. No longer am I only focused on, a handful or two of SBIR satellites to be my principal missile warning assets. I have got a level of proliferation that provides redundancy. They're also closer. So there's opportunities to improve detection, surveillance, warning, and tracking of capability, including hypersonics moving forward. So I think that's one thing. I think the second thing is we'll see what's the right organizing model for the presentation of this capability. The model that Derek and the team are pursuing integrates multiple missions onto these proliferated architectures. So we'll see what's the best model to present them. This is an exact case of where you can see in the future as we field these constellations moving forward, there's always going to be some level over a given year of capability that's launching to replenish or fill in with upgraded capability, or some that is coming offline as a legacy capability. That's a different mindset. It's not up there for like 25 years like we see with some DSPs, some of which you helped run. So I think it's both in employment models and operating concepts, but it's also in integration across the combat force that, can you imagine training against an adversary threat, whether that's direct descent, directed energy, or some other capability, and I've got that much kit for which I can help build resilience in my architecture. That's a whole new approach. So I think we're training differently, we'll plan to employ differently, and ultimately the presentation model will be unique for how we present those capabilities. I think those are the three key areas that I'm focused on.
Great answers. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the Schriever Spacepower series. Thank you again, General Miller, for joining us today. This is a great conversation. You answered a lot of questions I had, that's for
great.
Sure. And it's always a pleasure to be with you.
No, thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
So from all of us at Mitchell Space, have a great space power kind of day. Good day, folks.